The gap in the living room reached me before Derek's voice did. I had walked that same route home from my last lesson for 6 years, and for 6 years the first thing my eyes found through the front window was the black shoulder of my father's upright piano, catching the porch light like the flank of a sleeping animal. That evening, the window gave back an empty wall, a rectangle of paler paint where the piano had guarded the room, and 4 small craters pressed into the rug where its casters had stood since before I could reach the pedals. Derek was standing in the middle of that emptiness with a glass of red wine in his hand, the good glasses, the wedding ones, at 6 on a Tuesday. "You never play it," he said before I had my coat off. "It just sat there collecting dust and taking up the whole room, and somebody paid real money for the wood." He swirled the glass. "Real money, Gabrielle, which, considering what your side of this family has cost mine, I'd call overdue." There it was, in one breath. The whole story they had spent 2 years pouring into me. That my father, Elias Myers, had died in debt. That the house I grew up in, the house we all still lived in, my childhood home that Derek had married his way into, would have to be sold out from under us to cover what he owed, and that we were only staying on in it, among my father's tools and my father's piano, by the Kessler's patience. That I had walked into this marriage with nothing but a scratched piano and a brother who would need minding for the rest of his life, and that the Kesslers, in their patience, in their charity, were owed a gratitude I could apparently never finish paying. I did not scream. I want you to understand that first, because everything that came after depended on it. I stood in the doorway with my keys still biting into my palm, and I looked at the 4 dents in the rug, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very cold, the way a room goes quiet right before the storm reaches it. My brother Danny was upstairs. I could hear the soft rhythmic knock of him rocking his chair against the wall, the sound he makes when the shape of the house changes and no one warns him. Danny is 19. He is autistic, and my father's piano had stood in that spot every day of his life, and Derek had let 2 men carry it out the door while Danny watched from the stairs. That was the thing I held on to, not the wine, not the word overdue, the knock of a chair against a wall upstairs. "Who bought it?" I asked. Derek blinked, because he had braced for tears and I had handed him a question instead. "Some old guy, restores pianos, resells them. Why?" "Can you get me his number?" I said. "There are 3 books of Dad's sheet music in the bench, handwritten. They belong with the instrument. I'd like to send them along so the set stays together." I kept my voice even, almost warm, the voice I use to tell a 7-year-old that the wrong note is fine. "We'll try the measure again." Derek's shoulders came down an inch. He thought he had gotten away with something and been thanked for it. He had no idea that the sheet music was the first thing I'd ever asked him for that I fully intended to use. My father built things with his hands his whole life. Cabinets, staircases, a jewelry box for my mother with a false bottom she never found the trick of. He also built the drawer that lived under that piano's key bed, and only 2 people in the world knew it was there. One of them was in the ground. The other was standing in a doorway with cold keys in her fist, asking her husband very politely for a phone number. "You should know my name. It's Gabrielle Myers. I'm 29 years old. I teach piano in a town where everyone is quite sure they already know whose daughter I am. And 2 years ago, I let these people convince me I was a burden being carried." If you've ever been made small in your own home by someone smiling while they do it, stay with me to the end of this. I don't think you'll want to look away. And before we go on, tell me something in your own head, honestly. If it had been your father's piano gone from the wall, would you have asked for that number too? Because I'll tell you what happened when I did. The buyer called back within the hour. I had not even finished making Danny's dinner. Plain pasta, butter, the bowl he likes, the blue one. When the phone rang, a number I didn't know. He'd found ours, Mr. Ashby told me later, penciled inside the piano bench on the flyleaf of the very sheet music I'd meant to send him. My father had written his name and our number on his instrument, the way a craftsman signs his work, and a good restorer always looks where the music is. The voice on the other end was old, careful, a little formal. The voice of a man who has spent his life listening to instruments and has learned to listen to people the same way. Mrs. Kessler, my name is Warren Ashby. I bought an upright piano from your husband this afternoon. Myers, I said. I kept my father's name. It was his piano. There was a pause on the line, and in that pause, I heard him rearrange everything he had assumed. Ms. Myers, he said more slowly now, I'd like to bring it back. Tonight, if that's all right. I won't be taking any money for it. Your husband already has his check, and I'll be tearing it up. This isn't a sale I'm willing to keep. I sat down on the kitchen floor with the wooden spoon still in my hand. I don't understand. When I load an old instrument, I always sound the cabinet, Mr. Ashby said. Habit. You learn where the hollows should be and where they shouldn't. This one has a hollow that shouldn't be there, under the key bed, and it isn't empty. I didn't open it. I want to be very clear about that. I did not open it because it isn't mine and it isn't your husband's either. But you should open it, Ms. Myers, when you're alone. Whatever your father put in that piano, he did not put it there for it to be sold with the wood. Outside, the streetlight came on. Inside me, the cold thing that had gone quiet in the doorway began, very slowly, to turn. I want to tell you what those 2 years had done to me, so that you understand why a hollow in a piano could feel like a door opening in a wall I thought was solid. My father raised Danny and me mostly alone. My mother left when Danny was small, when the diagnosis was new and the word autism still landed in our house like a stone through a window, and she couldn't stand under the weight of it. My father could. He was a quiet man, a woodworker who taught piano in the evenings to keep the lights on, and he built our whole lives around one unspoken promise, that Danny would always be safe, that there would always be a system in place, money set aside, a plan so that the day my father wasn't there, my brother would not fall through the floor of the world. He taught me to play on that upright, and he'd given it to me outright years before he died. Signed it over to me the week I taught my first student. So it's yours no matter what, Gabby, whatever comes. As though even then, laughing, he was thinking about the kind of people who take things. He'd sit on the bench beside me with his sawdust-smelling hands and set his brass metronome ticking, that steady, patient talk, 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 and he'd say, "You don't chase it, Gabby. You keep your own time and let the music come to you." I thought he was talking about scales. It took me 2 years after his death to understand he was telling me who he was. He died in September 2 autumns ago, a heart that simply stopped one morning while he was sanding a drawer front in his workshop. And into the silence he left behind walked my husband and his mother, with paperwork and casseroles and a story. Derek handled the estate. He was a real estate broker, after all. He understood documents, he said. He'd spare me the grief of it. His mother, Judith, sat with me at the kitchen table and held my hand and told me my father had loved me, but had been a proud man, a private man, and proud private men leave messes. There were debts, they said. The house had to be sold. The trust my father had always promised for Danny. The money I'd grown up hearing about. The thing that let me sleep was smaller than he'd let on, sweetheart. You know how he exaggerated to make you feel secure? And there was a will. I saw it once. A single page, my father's signature at the bottom looking thin and unsteady, dated 3 weeks before he died. It left everything to be liquidated to settle obligations, named Derek as executor, and reduced Danny's care to a monthly figure so small it made me sick to read it. I remember asking why the signature looked like that, like a man writing with a hand that didn't want to move. Judith said, "He was dying, dear. We just didn't know it yet." I believed them. That's the part I can barely say out loud even now. I believed them, and I was grateful, and for 2 years I let my husband tell dinner guests that he'd taken on a lot when he married me. And I passed the potatoes and said nothing, because I was tired, and because Danny needed the roof, and because grief makes you soft in exactly the places you most need to be hard. The house, my father's house, the house with the pencil marks on the door frame measuring Danny and me, had not sold yet. It was tied up, Derek said. Complications, buyers pulling out, you wouldn't understand the market. I'd stopped asking. That was my mistake, and it was about to become his. Mr. Ashby's truck pulled into the driveway a little after 8. He was a small, stooped man in his 70s, with reading glasses pushed up into white hair, and he had brought his grandson to help carry, a broad, quiet young man who nodded at me and said nothing. They rolled the piano back through the front door on a dolly and set it exactly in its 4 dents, as though it had never left, and Danny came halfway down the stairs and stopped and stared at it, and made a sound I hadn't heard from him in 2 years. A low, relieved hum, the sound he makes when a broken thing is made right. Derek was not home. He'd gone out to celebrate closing a big one, which I would later learn was its own kind of confession. Mr. Ashby wouldn't come in for coffee. At the door, he took my hand in both of his, old and dry and strong, and he said, "I've handled a great many instruments that outlive the people who love them. Whatever's in there, take your time with it. And Ms. Myers, get yourself a lawyer before you tell a single soul what you find. I've been doing this long enough to know that a man doesn't hide a thing in a piano unless he's afraid of the people standing around his bed." Then he was gone, and it was just me and Danny and my father's piano, home again in the dark. I waited until Danny was asleep. Then I knelt down in front of the upright, and I ran my hands along the underside of the key bed the way I'd watched my father run his hands along wood 1,000 times, feeling for the grain, for the seam, for the place where a craftsman hides a thing so well that only love would ever find it. And there it was, a shallow drawer, no deeper than a book, held shut by a wooden peg my father had turned on his own lathe. I pressed it the way the jewelry box had taught me, sideways and up, and the drawer slid open with the small, dry sigh of well-made joinery. Inside were 2 things. The first was a document folded once on heavy paper, a last will and testament handwritten in my father's careful hand, every letter of it his, signed and dated, and here my own hands began to shake, dated 11 days after the thin, unsteady will that Derek had filed with the court, a later will, witnessed, notarized with a stamp from a notary 2 towns over, a woman I'd never heard of. It revoked all prior wills. It left the house, outright and free, to me. It left a fully funded special needs trust to my brother Daniel, with a schedule of figures that made the thin will's numbers look like the lie they were, and it named as trustee, not Derek, not Judith, but my father's own attorney, and after him, me. The second thing in the drawer was a cassette tape, the kind my father used in the little recorder he kept in his workshop to leave himself notes. There were 2 words on the label, in his hand, and then his name. "Listen alone, Dad." I sat on the floor of my living room at 2 in the morning, holding my father's true will in one hand and his voice in the other, and I understood all at once and completely that everything I had been told for 2 years was a single sentence built to hold up a lie. He had not died in debt. He had not left me nothing. He had not been a proud, careless man who left a mess. He had been a frightened one who had built a hidden drawer and filled it and told no one, because the people at his bedside were the ones he was hiding it from. I did not cry. Not then. I sat very still, and somewhere in the back of my mind I heard the metronome start to tick, steady and patient, tock, 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 and I began, for the first time in 2 years, to keep my own time. To understand why I could kneel there so calmly, you have to understand the 2 years that taught me to keep my face still. They had a way of telling the story that always happened in front of other people. At Kessler barbecues, at Judith's holiday table, Derek would refill his glass and settle into it like a favorite chair. "You should have seen what I took on," he'd say, warm, self-deprecating, a good sport. Married Gabrielle and inherited a broken piano and a brother who'll be 19 forever. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter. Judith patting my hand. Her father, God rest him, meant well, but he left these two with nothing but debts and worry. We couldn't just let them sink. And I would sit there with Danny beside me, flapping his hands under the table because the room was too loud, and I would say nothing because they owned the story, and I was too tired to fight for a version of my father that no one at that table wanted to hear. That is what grief does. It hands the pen to whoever seems steady. I was drowning, and they looked like dry land. And so I let them write my father into a cautionary tale, and I called it gratitude. But I had grown up on the other version. I had sat on the bench beside a man who smelled of sawdust and set a brass metronome ticking and said, "You don't chase it, Gabby. You keep your own time, and you let the music come to you." A man who did everything himself, who fixed the roof and filed the taxes and built the trust for Danny alone, who never once asked me to carry any of it. For years, I'd read that as a kind of distance. He loves me, I'd think, but he handles the real things himself, because he doesn't quite trust me with them. It was the small, private ache I never told anyone, the splinter under the nail of an otherwise good childhood, that I was the daughter he adored and the daughter he never leaned on. Kneeling in front of that open drawer, I did not yet know that the ache was about to be answered. I only knew that the man they'd spent 2 years describing had just reached out of the ground and put his real voice in my hand, and that whoever they thought I was, the burden, the drowning girl, the daughter with nothing, they had made the same mistake the confident always make. They had told me I had nothing to fight with, right up until I did. I did not confront Derek in the morning. I know that's the part that will make some of you want to shake me. He was standing at the counter in his shirt sleeves, scrolling his phone, complaining about a closing that had hit a snag, and everything in me wanted to put my father's will on the granite between the coffee and the car keys and watch his face come apart. That's what you're supposed to do. That's the scene everyone imagines. But I had learned something on the floor at 2 a.m, holding a tape I hadn't yet dared to play. I had learned that the will and the tape were not weapons yet. They were only paper and plastic. A husband who handled documents for a living could make paper disappear, could call it a forgery, could get to a notary 2 towns over before I could spin a story to a judge who golfed with his broker friends. If I showed my hand now, I would be handing it to the one person in the world best equipped to break it. So I did the coldest thing I have ever done. I poured his coffee. I asked about the snag. I let him tell me, with real irritation, that the Myers place was this close to closing and some paperwork was gumming it up, and I nodded, and inside I filed away one enormous fact. He was still selling my father's house. The house that, according to the paper folded in my coat pocket, was already legally mine. That morning, while Danny worked through his puzzles at the kitchen table, I made 2 phone calls I told no one about. The first was to a copy service and a notary of my own, where I made 3 certified copies of my father's true will and sealed the original in a safe deposit box in a bank Derek had no card for. You do not fight over an original. You fight over an original you have already made untouchable. The second call was harder because it meant listening to the tape. I did it in my car, in the parking lot behind the grocery store, with the doors locked and the phone recording the playback as backup. My father's voice filled that little space, tired and careful, and I have listened to it so many times since that I could recite it in my sleep. He said the date. He said he was of sound mind. He said that on the 9th of that month he had signed a will that does not say what I want because I was made to. And then he said the sentence that turned my grief into something with edges. Derek and his mother told me that if I didn't sign it their way, they would make sure Danny's care stopped the day I died, that the trust would be tied up so long the money would be gone before the courts sorted it out, that a boy like Danny would end up somewhere I wouldn't want to think about. Judith sat in my kitchen and said it to my face while she poured my tea, so I signed their paper to keep them calm. And then I made the real one, and I hid it where the only person who ever kept time with me will find it. There is a specific kind of cold that comes from learning that someone used your defenseless brother as a crowbar to pry a dying man's hand open. I sat in that parking lot and let it fill me all the way up, and when it was done, I was not shaking anymore. A recording a person makes of their own voice is legal in this state. One party has to consent, and my father had consented to himself. My lawyer told me that later. That afternoon, I only knew that my father had left me his voice on purpose, and that he had trusted me to keep my own time and let the music come to me. So I did not chase it. I began to gather. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a very good liar in the specific dialect of marriage. I learned to ask Derek about the Myers closing, with just enough vague, grieving disinterest that he never once suspected I was building a timeline. I learned that the buyer for my father's house was a shell company, and that the shell company's money was quietly plugging a hole in a commercial deal of Derek's that had gone sideways. A strip of retail he'd over-leveraged, investors circling, a personal guarantee he'd signed that could take our own house down with it. That was the tawdry engine under all of it. Not some grand conspiracy. A middling real estate broker who'd bet too big and needed a dead man's house to cover it, and had a wife whose father had conveniently, he thought, left nothing to fight over. Before I found a lawyer, I found the notary. Her name was printed at the bottom of my father's true will in a small, precise stamp. Marion Delacroix, 2 towns over, a name I had never heard in my life. I drove there on a Wednesday while Danny was at his program, and I sat across a desk from a broad, unhurried woman in her 60s who looked at the certified copy I laid down and then looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. "You have his eyes," she said. I wondered if anyone would ever come. She remembered him. Of course she did. A notary keeps a journal, a bound logbook with a line for every act, the date, the identification, sometimes a thumbprint, a legal record that does not care whose feelings it wounds. She turned to the page. There he was, Elias Myers, that September, 11 days after the document Derek had filed. She remembered that he'd come alone, that he'd paid cash, that he'd been thin and gray and careful, and that when she'd asked, as she always did, Whether he was signing freely and of his own will, he had looked at her and said, "This is the only thing I've signed freely in a month." She remembered he'd asked her to keep her copy somewhere safe and to tell no one unless someone came asking with his eyes. He said his family couldn't know yet, Marion told me. He said there were people at his house who'd undo it if they found it. I notarize wills for dying men more often than you'd think, and I've learned not to ask. But I've thought about him. I hoped somebody would come. I sat in my car in her parking lot afterward, and I did not cry, though it was close, because I could see it now. My father, dying, driving himself 2 towns over so no one at his own bedside would know, signing the truth in cash and secrecy, hiding it in the one place his hands had made and his daughter's ears would find. He had not been careless. He had been braver and more alone than I had ever let myself imagine. Then I went to see Mr. Ashby. He met me at his workshop, surrounded by the ribs of half-restored instruments, and when I told him what I'd found under the key bed, he closed his eyes for a moment as though something he'd suspected had been confirmed. He agreed, without my even finishing the ask, to put in writing exactly what had happened, that Derek Kessler had sold him the upright representing it as his own to sell, that Ashby had paid by check, that he had sounded the cabinet and found the hidden compartment, and that upon learning the instrument was not the seller's separate property to convey, he had returned it and voided the sale. He signed it and had it notarized himself, the careful old craftsman, and handed it to me like a man handing over a tool he knew I'd need. "A piano remembers who loved it," he said at the door. "So do courts if somebody makes them listen. Go make them listen." That night, I did something I hadn't done since the funeral. I sat down at my father's piano. The bench still held his 3 books of handwritten sheet music, the ones I'd used as my excuse to Derek, and under them the faint smell of him. Sawdust and rosin and the peppermints he kept in his shirt pocket. I lifted the fallboard and put my hands on keys I'd been avoiding for 2 years, because touching them had felt like touching a wound, and I played the lullaby he taught me first, the one he'd play with his sawdust hands while Danny was small and screaming, and the whole house felt like it was coming apart. Halfway through the first phrase, I heard Danny come down the stairs. He didn't speak. He sat on the bottom step, out of the light, and rocked gently. Not the anxious knock against the wall, but a slow, easy sway. In time. In time. My brother, who the evaluator's notes would soon describe with words like limited and unresponsive, was keeping the tempo of a lullaby he hadn't heard in 2 years, his head moving talk, 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 exactly our father's tempo, exactly the metronome. And I understood something sitting there that I would not fully understand until much later, that the music had never left this house. It had only been waiting, the way the true will had been waiting, in the one place no one thought to look. I did not chase it. I kept my own time, and my brother kept it with me, and for the length of one lullaby, the 2 of us were exactly where our father had left us, safe inside the thing he'd built with his hands. When it was done, Danny said, to the piano, not to me, Dad's song. And then he went back upstairs to bed, calm, and I sat alone in the dark with my hands still on the keys and let the cold in me be, for just a few minutes, something warmer. Then I closed the fallboard and I went back to work. I found a probate attorney 3 counties away, a woman named Renata Voss, who took one look at the later will and the transcript of the tape and went very still, the way Mr. Ashby had gone still on the phone. "Do you understand what you have?" she asked. I said I was beginning to. She said, You have a validly executed later will that revokes the instrument currently in probate. You have a recording that speaks to undue influence and possibly criminal fraud in the execution of that earlier instrument. You have a conversion claim for the sale of separate property, the piano, that you never consented to. She folded her hands. And you have a husband who does not know you have any of it. He can't know, I said, not until it can't be undone. Renata almost smiled. Then let's make sure that when he finds out, he's the one who put the last piece in our hands. So I gathered, and part of gathering was learning to read my own marriage like a set of documents. Derek was careless with paper at home because he thought paper was his native tongue, and mine was scales and lullabies. For 2 years, I had signed what he put in front of me and asked nothing. Now I read everything. I read it at night at the kitchen table with my phone camera steady, and slowly the tawdry machine under our life came into focus. There was a strip of retail property 3 exits up the interstate that Derek had bought at the top of the market with money that wasn't quite his, leveraged against a personal guarantee he'd signed with a confidence I could now see was closer to panic. The tenants had left. The loan had not. There were emails. He never deleted anything. Why would he? He was the smartest man in every room. From investors whose patience was thinning into threats, and from a lender using the phrase acceleration of the note in a way that made my stomach turn, even though I was the one holding the knife. And there, threaded through all of it like a bright wire, was my father's house. The buyer was a limited liability company with a name that meant nothing and an address that turned out to be a mailbox. When I followed the money on the closing statements Derek had left in a folder marked, without a trace of irony, Myers, cleanup, it ran in a neat circle. The proceeds of my father's house would land in an account that would, the same week, wire nearly the identical sum to satisfy the angriest of Derek's investors and buy him room on the guarantee. He was not selling my childhood home to settle my father's debts. There were no debts. He was selling my childhood home to pay for his own bad bet, and he had spent 2 years building the story of a bankrupt dead man so that when the house went, no one, least of all me, would think to ask where it went. I photographed all of it. I did not take a single original. I want to be exact about that because it mattered to me then, and it matters now. I looked only at what a wife had every right to see. I copied nothing I hadn't been shown, and everything I built out of things Derek himself had left lying in the open, certain the woman across the table couldn't read the language. Renata laid the photographs out on her desk in 3 rows, the failing strip, the shell buyer, the circling money, and she tapped the middle row once. "This is the why," she said. "Judges want the why. A man who forges his way past a dead father's wishes for the abstract love of money is a villain in a play. A man who did it to plug a hole in a strip mall he over-leveraged is a man they've met." She squared the photographs into a single stack. "Keep letting him think you can't read. The more he does before he knows, the less there'll be to argue about later." I drove home that night past the exit for the retail strip, and I made myself look at it. The dark storefronts, the for lease banners going gray in the weather, and I felt the cold thing in me settle another degree, because I understood at last that my father's whole life's work, the safety he'd built for a boy who couldn't build it himself, had been fed to that row of empty stores by a man in good shirts who thought love was an inefficiency. Here is what I understood, sitting in her office: a will contest, a fraud, a conversion. These are not lightning bolts. They are trains, and a train only wrecks the man standing on the tracks if he keeps standing there. Sure, the whistle he hears is for somebody else. My husband was going to keep standing there. I was going to make sure of it. The window I want to tell you about now is the window that came before anything exploded, and I have come to believe it is the part that matters most. Because in those weeks, I knew, and Derek did not. I knew that the house he was bragging about closing was already mine. I knew that the will in his lawyer's file was a forgery of consent, wrung out of a frightened father with my brother's name. I knew there was a tape, and he, my husband in his good shirts refilling his own wine, knew none of it, and so he kept doing the things that a man does when he is certain he has already won. He started coming home lighter, looser, because the money from the piano and the promise of the house closing had eased the pressure on his failing deal. One night he had his mother over for dinner, and Judith sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once threatened my father over a cup of tea. Though I said nothing, I only watched her hands, and she told me with that warm, awful patience of hers that I really ought to let Derek finish sorting out your father's affairs, that dwelling on the past isn't healthy for you or for Danny, and that she'd always thought it was a mercy the old man went quick before things got hard for him. I set down the serving spoon. I looked at the 4 dents in the rug through the doorway and the piano standing over them, home again. And I said, "You're right, Judith. It's time I let the past be settled properly." She heard agreement. Derek heard a wife giving up. What I meant was something neither of them had the ears for, and that is the whole terrible pleasure of a window. The people inside it cannot see the glass. The window held one more thing I did not expect, and it was the ugliest of all. A little over a week before he brought me the waiver, Derek sat me down with his mother beside him and told me, in the gentle voice people use for bad news they're enjoying, that they were worried about me. That grief had changed me, that I seemed fixated, not myself, maybe not able right now to give Danny the structure he needs, and that they had spoken to someone, a lawyer, of course, always a lawyer, about whether it might be kinder for everyone if Derek were named Danny's guardian. Just to take the pressure off you, Gabby, just so someone steady is holding the reins. I understood exactly what I was looking at. They had used my brother once already as a crowbar against a dying man. Now, sensing something shifting under their feet without being able to name it, they were reaching for him again. To control the one person in the family no one thought to watch, to reinforce their story that I was the fragile one, and to put Derek's hand on anything that might have Danny's name on it. They did not know about the note. They did not know about the will. They only knew, in the animal way that guilty people know, that they wanted more grip, and Danny was where they had always reached for it. An evaluator came to the house. I want to tell you that part plainly because it was the hardest hour of the whole affair, and it had nothing to do with money. A stranger with a clipboard sat in my living room and asked my brother questions in a bright, wrong voice, and Danny, who reads a raised eyebrow like a paragraph, who feels a false note in a room the way I feel one in a chord, went silent and rocked and would not look up. And Derek sat there with a sad, patient expression that said, "See what I mean?" And I had to keep my own face perfectly still while everything in me screamed. That was the night I stopped thinking of any of this as a fight over a house. I called Renata before the evaluator's car was out of the drive. She was calm in the way that steadied me. A guardianship petition, she said, is a matter of record and a matter of proof, and they had neither the proof nor, once we were done, the record they wanted. She would file a response. She would request the evaluator's raw notes, and she paused here, and I heard the cold click of her mind meeting mine. She would let their own petition stand in the file a little while, unopposed on its face, because a written sworn attempt by Derek Kessler to seize control of my brother, dated in the very weeks he was liquidating my father's estate, was not a threat to us. It was a gift. It was intent, in his own hand, to reach the one thing my father had died protecting. "They think they're taking the reins," Renata said. "Let them put their names on the harness. We'll show the court who's been driving." So I did the coldest thing a sister can do with her own fear. I did not scream that they would never touch my brother. I smiled, and I said I understood they were only trying to help, and I let Derek believe I was folding on that too. And upstairs that night, I sat on the floor of Danny's room while he knocked his chair against the wall, and I hummed until the knocking slowed and stopped and his breathing went even. And I promised him in the dark that no one was ever going to use his name as a crowbar again. 2 days later, Derek brought me the paper he'd been building toward for 2 years, without either of us naming it. He slid it across the counter after dinner. Apologetic, reasonable, a man doing me a favor, a waiver, a quitclaim, and a waiver of any right to contest the estate. "Just to clean things up so the closing can go through, honey. It's a formality. The lawyers need it." He'd even flagged the signature line with a little sticky arrow the way he flagged closings for his clients. I looked at that arrow for a long moment. Then I told him I'd read it over the weekend and I took it upstairs and I did not sign it. Not yet. Because a waiver signed by a woman with nothing is worthless. But a waiver signed by a woman who has already, quietly, filed a petition to admit her father's real will to probate, that is not a surrender. That is a trap with my husband's own handwriting inviting him in. I called Renata that night. "He gave me the waiver," I said. She was quiet for a second, and then she said the sentence I think about still, "Perfect. Let's file first. Let him sign into a court that already knows the truth." That is the exact center of this story, and I want to slow down so you don't miss the shape of it. On a Thursday morning, without telling my husband, Renata Voss filed a petition in probate court to admit my father's later will, the true one, the one from the piano, and to set aside the earlier instrument on the grounds of undue influence and fraud. Attached was the certified copy of the will, an affidavit from the notary 2 towns over who remembered my father perfectly, and a sealed reference to a recording that would be produced in due course. The court accepted it. A hearing was set. The estate, including a certain house Derek was this close to closing, was frozen by operation of law the moment that petition landed, though the freeze would take a few days to ripple out to the title company, and Derek did not know to look for it. On Friday, I signed his waiver. I sat at the kitchen counter with Danny doing a puzzle beside me and my husband watching with a satisfied little smile, and I signed my name to a document waiving my right to contest an estate I had already contested the day before. I even let my hand hesitate, let him see what he thought was a wife swallowing the last of her pride. He kissed the top of my head. He said, "Thank you, Gabrielle. I know this hasn't been easy. You're doing the right thing for us. I should tell you what it costs to be kissed on the head by a man you are, at that exact moment, quietly dismantling. It costs more than the rage would. Rage is easy. Rage is loud and clean. This was different. This was letting my own husband press his mouth to my hair and thank me for surrendering, while a folded copy of my father's real will sat in a safe deposit box he'd never seen, and a petition with both our names on it sat stamped in a courthouse he didn't know to check. I held still for it. I even said, "I know." I held still and let him have his moment, and inside I kept my own time, talk, 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 the way I'd learned to keep it by then. Some of you will think that makes me cold. Maybe it does. But I had spent 2 years being warm at that table, warm and grateful and quiet while they rewrote my father into a debtor and my brother into a burden. And warmth had cost me my whole family's truth. Cold, it turned out, was what love looked like once I finally understood what love was up against. My father kept his own time in a room full of people threatening his son. I could keep mine through one kiss on the head. Then he did the thing I needed him to do. He got comfortable. Over the following week, believing the last obstacle removed, Derek got sloppy in the specific way that confident men get sloppy. He signed the closing documents on my father's house, documents in which he represented in writing that he had the authority to sell it and that the estate was unencumbered. He emailed his investors that the liquidity issue was resolved, attaching a summary of where the money had come from and where it was going. He bragged to his mother. On a call, I could hear through the wall that he'd finally gotten Gabrielle to sign off and that the Myers house money would make the whole retail thing disappear. And smallest and largest of all, he had already spent the proceeds of the piano, my father's piano, separate property, sold without my consent. And when I asked him idly over coffee what he'd done with that piano money, he laughed and said he'd put it toward the boat slip he'd been wanting. And wasn't it funny? All that fuss over an old box of wood. Every one of those things was a brick he was handing me. He had signed documents claiming authority he did not have over a house that was legally mine. He had put in writing that he had converted the proceeds of my separate property. He had told his mother in his own words that he had pressured me into a waiver. He thought he was tidying up a victory. He was, in fact, notarizing his own confession, one cheerful sentence at a time. In the days after, a court had already been told the truth and was simply waiting for him to arrive. The cruelest of those cheerful days came on a Sunday. Derek, riding the high of a wife who'd signed and a deal about to close, decided it was time to really clear the decks. He came home with a stack of flattened boxes and announced, generous as ever, that he'd take care of the rest of your dad's stuff so I wouldn't have to deal with the sad part. He meant the workshop, my father's tools, his half-finished cabinets, the jewelry box with the false bottom, the recorder that matched the tape. He'd already, he mentioned, had a guy come look at the tools, and there was an estate lot buyer interested in the whole garage. I stood in the kitchen holding a dish towel and felt the cold go all the way down to my feet. Because here was the thing I understood in that moment that he did not. A man who has just been told by a court that a will is being contested, and who responds by trying to liquidate more of the contested estate faster before anyone can stop him, is not covering his tracks. He is laying more of them in wet cement at a dead sprint. Every box he packed, every buyer he called, every piece of my father he tried to turn into cash while a probate freeze spread toward him like frost across a window, was one more sworn, dateable, provable act of a man. Converting property, he'd been formally warned, wasn't his. So I did not stop him. God forgive me, I let him pack. I said in my flattest voice, "Whatever's easiest, Derek," and I watched him carry my father's life toward the garage in flattened boxes, whistling, and I wrote down the date, and I called Renata that night and told her, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He's gilding it. Let him. Judges hate a man who couldn't even wait." I hung up and went out to the workshop after he was asleep, and I quietly took back exactly one thing: my father's little recorder, the mate to the tape, because that one was evidence and I would not risk it. And I photographed everything else in place, untouched, and left it for the boxes. That was the last night I let anything of my father's leave a room without knowing where it went. It was also though Derek couldn't have known it. The night his sentence stopped being a possibility and became a matter of paperwork. He thought he was winning so completely he could afford to be greedy. He was, in fact, paying out the last of his own rope, hand over hand, whistling while he did it. I want to be honest about the pleasure of that week, because I think pretending it wasn't there would be a lie. Every time he bragged, something in me went warm and level, the way a room feels when the music finally lands on the beat. I didn't gloat. I didn't tip my hand. I would just glance at the piano in the corner, at the 4 dents holding it in place, and I'd hear my father's metronome in my head. Talk, 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 and I'd think, keep your own time. Let him keep his. His is almost up. He decided that week to celebrate. It was a small thing, which somehow made it worse. Judith over for dinner, a bottle of the good wine, Derek in an expansive mood because the money was almost his, and the wife had signed and the world was arranging itself the way he'd always assumed it should. He raised his glass over my father's own table, in my father's own house that he still believed he was about to sell out from under me, and he made a toast. To fresh starts, he said, to finally clearing out the old and making room. His eyes went, just for a second, to the corner where the piano stood back in its 4 dents, and he smiled. Some things you hold on to too long. Judith laughed her warm, terrible laugh. Danny, at the end of the table, went still over his plate, the way he does when the air changes. And I sat there with my hands folded and let the metronome start up in the back of my mind. Talk, talk, talk. Steady and patient. My father's tempo. And I thought, you have no idea what you're toasting. You are lifting a glass to a house that isn't yours over a table that will outlast you, in front of a boy who never forgets. And somewhere in a courthouse, a clerk has already stamped the date on the thing that ends you. I did not say it. I lifted my water and touched it to his glass and let it ring, one clear note, and I watched him mistake my calm for surrender one last time. To fresh starts, I said. Later, clearing the plates, I found Danny had lined up 6 wine corks in a neat row on the windowsill, oldest to newest, the way he orders the things that matter to him. 6 corks he'd saved, one at a time, over 2 years, kept in the shoebox in his room with his stones and his train schedules, and brought out now, all together, as if he'd been waiting to show me. 6 celebrations, I realized. 6 times these people had toasted their way through the taking of my family, and my brother had kept a record of everyone, because he is the one who never forgets. I left the corks where he'd put them. They were a kind of evidence, too, and I was learning that season to leave the evidence exactly where the honest ones set it down. The title company caught the freeze on a Wednesday. I know it was a Wednesday because Derek came home the color of old paper, phone still in his hand, and for the first time in 2 years, he did not have a story ready. The closing on my father's house had collapsed at the table. The title search had turned up a probate petition, a contested will, a Ellis pendens, a wall of legal machinery that had apparently sprung up out of nowhere. His buyer's lender had walked. His investors, CC'd on the good news a week earlier, had questions. And somewhere in the county courthouse was a document, filed under my father's name and mine, that his own lawyer was now reading with a rising sense of professional dread. "Did you do this?" he said. "Not a story, a question. The same question I'd handed him the night the piano vanished. Come all the way back around." "Do what?" I said. He told me. He told me in a rush, pacing the living room, that there was a second will that was obviously fake, that some lawyer 3 counties away had filed garbage to shake us down, that your father barely knew what day it was at the end, and couldn't have written a will. He said the word forgery. He said it 3 times, the way a man says a word he's trying to convince himself of. I let him finish. Then I said quietly, "You filed a will you knew was signed under threat. You told a court my father was of sound mind when you'd made sure he wasn't. You sold his piano and put a hidden drawer in a stranger's truck, and the stranger was a better man than you, so it came back." I stood up. "I didn't do this to you, Derek. You did it to a dying man in his own kitchen. I just kept the receipt." His face did the thing I'd waited 2 years without knowing I was waiting for it. The certainty draining out, replaced by the dawning arithmetic of a man realizing that every brick he'd cheerfully handed over was about to be stacked into a wall he was standing behind. He reached, of course, for the oldest tool he had. He softened. He sat down. He called me Gabby, which only my father was ever allowed to call me. He said we could handle this as a family, that there was no need for lawyers and courts, that he'd only ever tried to protect me from the stress of it all, that his mother loved me like a daughter. He said he'd been under so much pressure with the business and had made some choices he wasn't proud of, but that no one needed to get hurt. I let him talk, and when he was done, I said the only sentence I'd rehearsed. "You'll hear from Ms. Voss." And I went upstairs to my brother, who was rocking his chair against the wall because the voices downstairs had gotten loud, and I sat on the floor beside him until the knocking slowed and stopped. The next weeks were the long, unglamorous work of a lie coming apart in daylight, and I found I had no appetite for spectacle. It happened in offices, in filings, in the small, deadly increments of institutions doing what they are built to do once someone finally hands them the truth. Renata deposed the notary who'd stamped the earlier will, Gerald Pell, a man who did commissions on the side and had, it turned out, notarized that thin September document without my father in the room. He'd done it as a favor to Derek, whose deals he'd stamped for years. Confronted with the later will, with the tape, with the dates that didn't survive contact with each other, Pell's story fell apart in an afternoon. He surrendered his commission to the state before they could take it, which fooled no one and saved him nothing. The notary regulators opened a case and the county attorney's office opened a bigger one. I sat in on the Pell deposition, in a beige conference room with a court reporter's keys clicking like a smaller, meaner metronome, and I watched a man discover in real time that the favor he'd done a friend had a floor that dropped out. Gerald Pell was the kind of man who'd notarized closings for Derek for years, a stamp for hire, genial and incurious. He came in certain this was a formality, a nuisance filed by a hysterical widow's daughter. Renata was very gentle with him, which is how I learned that gentleness in her hands was the sharpest thing in the room. She asked him to describe his standard practice. He described it beautifully. Always confirm the signer's identity. Always witness the actual signing. Never, ever stamp a document for someone not physically present. Then she laid the September will in front of him and asked him to confirm his seal. He did, with a small, proud flourish. And then she asked him where, exactly, Elias Myers had been sitting when he signed it. The room got very quiet, because Marion Delacroix's logbook, 2 towns over, put my father in her office on a date after Pell's stamp claimed to have watched him sign, because the tape, in my father's own voice, described being made to sign their paper with no notary in the room at all. Because Elias Myers, by then, could not drive himself to Pell's office, and had not, and there were pharmacy records, and a neighbor, and a dozen small true things that all agreed my father had not been where Gerald Pell had sworn he was. Pell's lawyer asked for a recess. When they came back, Pell had remembered that perhaps he had stamped the document as a courtesy based on Derek's assurance that the signature was genuine, which is a sentence that ends a notary's career the moment it's read into a record. He surrendered his commission that week, before the state could pull it. A gesture as empty as a man locking a door after the house is already gone. I did not gloat watching Pell's face fold. I thought about my father, driving himself 2 towns over to a stranger he could trust because the professionals in his own orbit had already been bought with the small currency of favors. And I thought, this is what a lie costs in the end. It costs you the people who'll stamp anything, right at the moment you need someone who won't. The tape went to the county prosecutor the same week, hand-delivered by Renata on the morning of a preliminary probate hearing, timed so that the will contest and the criminal referral arrived at the courthouse within the same hour, not by accident. I had chosen the hour the way my father chose where to hide a drawer, for the person who would find it. On the recording, in his own tired voice, my father named Derek and Judith and described being threatened with my brother's care. Undue influence is a civil matter, threatening a man to alter his will and filing that altered will with a court while swearing to its validity. That is fraud, and in this state that is the kind that comes with a case number and a courtroom that is not the probate kind. The morning I gave the county the tape, I gave it to a detective named Ruiz in an office that smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax, and I made myself watch his face as my father's voice filled the room. He listened all the way through without moving. Then he played it again, taking notes, and when it was done, he asked me quiet, precise questions. Who else could identify the voice? When had I found it? Who had had access to the piano? Could I establish the chain of every copy I'd made? I answered all of them, because Renata had taught me that the truth is only as strong as the record of how you came by it, and I had come by all of it honestly. A piano returned by an honest man, a compartment built by my father, a copy made at a licensed service, an original sealed in a box, nothing taken, nothing altered, nothing I hadn't every right to hold. You understand what this is, Ruiz said, not really a question. A recording a man makes of himself in this state we can use, and what he's describing, he tapped the little machine, a person threatening someone to change a will, then filing that will with a court and swearing it's valid. That's not a family squabble. That's fraud. That's a felony. You're aware that if we charge, your husband is a defendant, not a spouse you go home to. I'm aware, I said. He stopped being that the day he decided my brother was a bargaining chip. I had chosen the morning on purpose. Renata delivered the criminal referral to Ruiz's office and filed our production notice in the probate case within the same hour. The civil train and the criminal train pulling into the same station at the time I'd picked, the way my father had chosen where to hide a drawer, not at random, but for the person who'd find it at the moment it would do the most. By the time Derek's lawyer understood that the second will was not going away, the county already had the tape. By the time the county had the tape, the probate judge already had the will. There was no order in which my husband could learn one thing that gave him time to bury the other. Ruiz walked me out. At the door, he said gruffly, "The closest thing to comfort a man like that offers. For what it's worth, your father did everything right. Most people who get squeezed like that just sign and hope. He made a record and hid it and trusted the right person to find it." He almost smiled. "That takes a cool head." "He used to tell me not to chase it," I said, "to keep my own time." "Yeah?" Ruiz looked at the little machine one more time. "Well, he kept his." Judith came to see me before the hearing. She came alone, without Derek, and she sat at my kitchen table. I did not offer her tea, and she tried, for the better part of an hour, every register, a frightened woman has. Indignation first. This was a misunderstanding. My father had been confused. I was being poisoned against family by strangers and lawyers. Then grief. She'd lost sleep over Danny. She'd only ever wanted what was best. Then, at the end, the truth, or something adjacent to it. We were going to lose everything, she said. Derek's deal, the house, all of it. Your father had money just sitting there for a boy who... And she stopped, because even she could hear where that sentence was going. For a boy who what, Judith? I said. Say it. She didn't. But I watched her face finish the sentence, and it was the same sentence her son had been living inside for 2 years. That my brother, who could not defend himself, was a resource that had been criminally underused. That his father's love for him was an inefficiency to be corrected. I want to tell you I said something devastating. I didn't. I just looked at her for a long moment, and then I said, "You threatened a dying man over my brother's future. You're going to have to sit in a room now and explain that to people whose job it is to write it down." And I opened the door. Here is where I made the one choice in all of this that I still turn over at night. And I'll tell you about it because I think it's the only part that kept me a person. Renata had the county attorney's ear. The tape and the notary made a strong case against all 3 of them. Derek for the fraud and the conversion, Pell for the false notarization, Judith for her part in the threat, and for signing as a witness to a document she knew was extracted under duress. And I could have let it run to the wall for every one of them. But there was a night, 2 winters before my father died, when Danny had a meltdown so bad I couldn't reach him, when he'd wedged himself in the corner of his room with his hands over his ears, and I was alone and terrified and out of ideas. And it was Judith, this same Judith, who had come over at midnight and sat on the floor outside his door and hummed tunelessly for 2 hours, not touching him, not talking, just being a steady sound in the dark until he came back to himself. She hadn't done it for an audience. There was no one there but me. For a long time, that memory made the rest of it harder to believe. And then it made it easier, because I understood that a person can hold real tenderness and real cruelty in the same 2 hands, and that the second doesn't cancel the first, and the first doesn't excuse the second. So I told Renata to tell the prosecutor that I would not stand in the way of an arrangement for Judith. Cooperation. Her testimony against her son, a suspended sentence, on one condition, which was that she say, on the record, exactly what she and Derek had done to my father. Not because I forgave her. I want to be precise about that. Because she had once been a steady sound in the dark for my brother, and I was not willing to become someone who forgot that even about her. Not mercy, I told Renata, just an accurate account of a debt. Judith took the deal, and her testimony, it turned out, was the beam that brought the whole roof down on her son. I want to tell you about the hearing itself, because for 2 years I had imagined some version of it, and the real thing was quieter and stranger, and far more final than anything I'd pictured. It was a small courtroom, half full, fluorescent, nothing like television. Derek was there with a lawyer who looked tired before we began. Judith was there, on our side of the aisle now, which cost her something I could see in the set of her shoulders. Danny was not there. I'd made sure of that, arranged a good day for him at his program, because whatever happened in that room, my brother was not going to be an exhibit in it ever again. Renata did not raise her voice once. She laid it out the way you'd lay out a proof. Here is the will filed by the respondent, dated the 9th. Here is a later will, dated the 20th, validly executed and notarized, revoking all prior instruments. She called Marion Delacroix, who described a thin gray man who paid cash and signed freely and asked her to keep his secret. Here is the notarization on the earlier will, and here is the notary himself, Mr. Pell, who, she was so gentle. Would you tell the court again where Mr. Myers was sitting when he signed? And here, Your Honor, with the court's permission, is Mr. Myers in his own words. And then my father spoke in that courtroom. I had heard the tape 100 times by then, but hearing it there, in that official air, with a judge leaning forward and Derek going gray at his table, that was different. My father's tired voice said the date, said he was of sound mind, said he'd been made to sign, said Derek and his mother had threatened Danny's care, said he'd made the real one and hidden it where the only person who ever kept time with him would find it. When it got to that last part, my voice, his voice, filled the room, and I watched Judith close her eyes, and I watched Derek's lawyer put down his pen, and I kept my own eyes forward and dry, because I had done my crying on a floor at 2 in the morning, and this was not the place for it. The judge asked Derek's lawyer if he wished to challenge the authenticity of the later will or the recording. There was a long pause, a whispered conference, and then the smallest word in the language. No. There was nothing to challenge. That was the whole terrible elegance of it. My father had built a truth so solid that when the moment came, the men who'd spent 2 years lying had nothing left to say. You cannot cross-examine a logbook 2 towns over. You cannot argue with a dead man's own account of the threat you made. You cannot forge your way past the thing that was hidden in the one place you sold without checking. The probate court did not need long. A valid later will, properly witnessed and notarized, revokes an earlier one. A will procured by threat and fraud is no will at all. The judge admitted my father's true will and set aside the September instrument. The house with the pencil marks on the doorframe, came back to me, free and clear, and the frozen sale evaporated, taking with it Derek's last plug for his sinking deal. His investors, learning that the collateral had never been his to offer, called their guarantees. The retail strip he'd over-leveraged went into the hands of people who did not care about his feelings. The personal guarantee he'd signed followed him home, and because he had, in writing, represented authority, he didn't have, and converted the proceeds of property that wasn't his. The civil judgment for conversion came with a number and a repayment schedule, and the referral for fraud came with a court date and a very good chance of a conviction that would end the real estate license he built his whole shining self on top of. The state board opened its file the week the criminal case did. Gerald Pell lost his commission and paid his fine and will notarize nothing for anyone ever again. Judith kept her freedom and lost her standing, which for a woman who had spent her life being the tasteful, generous matriarch of a family was its own kind of sentence. She said her piece in a courtroom in front of people she'd hosted at her table, and there is no suspended sentence for that. Derek did not go quietly, but he went. Somewhere in there, he stopped calling me Gabby. The unraveling of Derek Kessler did not happen all at once, and it did not happen the way the movies promise. It happened along 3 separate wires, and I watched each one go dark. The first was the marriage itself, if that's still the word. For a few days after the freeze, he tried in order every tool in the box. Charm first. The Derek who could talk a nervous buyer into a mortgage, sliding onto the couch beside me with 2 glasses of wine I didn't touch, telling me we were a team, that no marriage is perfect, that we could put all this behind us if I'd just call off my lawyer. When that met the flat calm I'd been practicing for months, the charm curdled into rage. A night of it, low and vicious, the mask fully off, telling me I'd ruined us, that I was just like your father, sitting on money and secrets, the word father in his mouth like something he was spitting out. And when the rage found no purchase either, he reached, at the very bottom, for the threat. "You realize the house here has your name on it too," he said, quiet now, ugly. "You pull this thread, we both go down." I let him finish, and then I told him the one thing I'd been saving. I separated everything that could be separated, legally, weeks ago. This house is documented, traced, and clear of you. You can't take me down with you, Derek. I unhooked the car from the train while you were busy admiring the engine. I stood up. "You'll be hearing from Ms. Voss about the divorce, too. That one I'm filing myself." He stared at me like a man who just felt the floor he was standing on turn out to be a trap door he'd built. The second wire was the money, and money has no loyalty at all. The investors he'd CC'd on his triumphant email, the ones he'd assured that the liquidity issue was solved, read the news of a contested estate and a collapsed sale and did what investors do. They called the guarantee all at once. The over-leveraged strip up the interstate went into foreclosure, its for-lease banners replaced with a notice from a bank, and the personal guarantee Derek had signed with such swagger came home to roost on everything he personally owned that I hadn't already, lawfully, walked out of the fire. The boat slip went. The good car went. The wine, I noticed, stopped being the good wine. And the third wire was the one he'd spent his whole life plugged into, his name. Derek was his reputation, the sharp broker, the closer, the man who golfed with the right people. That kind of man is a wire the moment the current is cut. His brokerage, hearing that one of their own was under investigation for defrauding a probate court, discovered an urgent need to separate the firm's interests from his. His license went under review before the state board. The golf partners found other Saturdays. He had built himself entirely out of other people's belief in him. And belief, it turns out, is the fastest draining asset there is. He came to me one last time, near the end of that stretch, without the charm or the rage or the threat, which was somehow the most honest I'd ever seen him. He sat down at my father's table, and he put his head in his hands and said, "What am I supposed to do now, Gabrielle?" Not Gabby. He'd finally learned. And for a moment, I'll be honest, the old softness in me stirred, the wife-shaped reflex to comfort the man across the table. Then I looked at the corner of the room where the piano stood, and I thought of a dying man driving himself 2 towns over in secret, and a boy rocking his chair against a wall, and I found the reflex had no fuel left in it. "You're supposed to answer for it," I said. "That's all. Same as everyone does, eventually. You just did yours out loud, in writing, to a court." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm not going to punish you, Derek. I never was. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of the things you did while I wasn't looking. That's not revenge. That's just me, finally, keeping my own time instead of yours." He left that night with 2 suitcases. I changed nothing illegally, touched nothing that wasn't mine, said nothing to the neighbors. I simply let the doors his own hands had opened stay open, and let the cold come through them, and went upstairs to sit with my brother while the house got quiet around us for the first time in 2 years. The piano itself got its own small exact justice, and I confess I took a private satisfaction in that one, because Derek had sold my father's instrument, separate property, a gift from a father to a daughter, mine and never his to touch, and had spent the proceeds on a boat slip before the ink was dry. Renata brought a claim for conversion. the plain old civil wrong of treating another person's property as your own. Mr. Ashby's signed statement was the spine of it. He had bought the piano in good faith, discovered it wasn't Derek's to sell, and voided the sale himself. The court did not have to wonder about intent. Derek had already told me, laughing, what he'd done with the money. The judgment came with a number. It was not enormous. A used upright and a boat slip do not move the earth. But it was precise, and precision was the point. Derek was ordered to repay every dollar he'd taken for the piano, and the figure sat on the same docket as a house he'd lost and a license he was losing. A small clean line item in the ledger of a man learning that the law does not grade cruelty on a curve. You do not get to sell the thing a dead man taught his children to play on and keep the change. Not once someone makes a court listen. I used part of what came back to have the piano properly restored, by Mr. Ashby, of course. He replaced the worn hammers and voiced it and tuned it, and he would not overcharge me no matter how I argued. "Consider the difference my fee," he said, and put it toward the boys' lessons. Then he ran his hand along the case, over the hidden drawer he'd found by sound, and said quietly, "Good wood, built by someone who loved whoever'd be sitting here." He didn't know how right he was, or maybe, being who he was, he did. I thought that was the end of it. I had won, cleanly on paper, through the front door of the law, with my hands empty of anything I hadn't come by honestly. The house was mine. Danny's trust was intact and fully funded, exactly as my father had built it, safe from everyone. I had my father's real voice and his real will and his real intentions, and I had learned, too late to tell him, that he had never once thought of me as the daughter he loved but couldn't trust. He'd hidden the most important thing he owned where only I would find it. He had trusted me completely. The wound I'd carried without a name, that I was loved but never quite relied upon, closed over so quietly I almost didn't feel it heal. And then, on the afternoon the estate was finally settled, my brother handed me something, and I learned that my father had trusted someone even more than me. We were at the kitchen table, the paperwork was done. I was crying finally the way I hadn't let myself in 2 years, and Danny was watching me with that sideways attention of his. And when he saw the tears, he got up and went to the drawer in his room where he keeps the things that matter to him. The smooth stones, the train schedules, the objects the rest of us call clutter and he calls the world. And he came back and put a folded piece of paper into my hand. It was soft with age, worn along the creases the way paper gets when it's been held and unfolded and held again 1,000 times. It was my father's handwriting, and it was dated the night before he died. "Give this to your sister when you see her cry over the piano. Not before. You'll know. Dad." My father, on the last night of his life, had not trusted the will to the lawyer or the tape to me alone. He had also knelt down in front of my brother who the whole world, who Derek and Judith, and even, God help me, sometimes I had treated as though he understood nothing, as though he were a thing to be managed. And he had pressed a note into his hand and told him to hold it until he saw his sister cry over the piano. And Danny had. For 2 years, through everything, he had kept it in his drawer with his stones and his schedules, waiting for a sign the rest of us thought he was incapable of reading. He had watched me the day the piano came home. He had watched me at this table. And when the moment came, exactly as our father promised, he knew. "Dad said you'd cry," Danny told me, not looking at me, looking at the piano. "He said the music would come back to you. He said I should wait." And then he said the thing that took my breath. He said I was the one who'd remember because I never forget. The hall of it, that the man had known, that my father, in the last clear hours he had, understood that the child everyone underestimated was the surest keeper of all, the one who never forgets, the one no one would think to threaten because no one believed he was listening. He had chosen his overlooked son to carry the last piece of his trust across 2 years of grief and lies, and his son had carried it perfectly. I have thought a great deal since about what the world got wrong about my brother and what my father got right. We buried the last of it in the spring. It's a year later now, and I'm writing this at the kitchen table in my father's house, my house, with the door frame and its pencil marks a few feet away, and the upright piano back against the wall in the living room where it has stood for 30 years, over the 4 small dents that never quite lifted out of the rug. I decided to leave the dents. They're a record, too. Derek's criminal case ended the way cases like his tend to end when the evidence is a dead man's own voice. With a plea, a felony on his record, the permanent loss of his real estate license, and a restitution schedule he'll be paying long after he's forgotten the sound of my father's name. His retail deal is gone. The boat slip is gone. Last I heard, he was selling cars 2 towns over, in the town, as it happens, where the honest notary practices, though I don't imagine he appreciates the symmetry. He does not see Danny. That was not my choice to make on my brother's behalf. It was Danny's, and Danny made it by simply, calmly, never asking about him again. Gerald Pell notarizes nothing. Judith lives quietly now, her table empty of the people who used to fill it, and once a season she sends a card addressed to Danny, never to me, and I let him decide whether to open them. Sometimes he does. He is, my father was right, the one who never forgets. But forgetting and forgiving were never the same thing in our house, and Danny keeps his own careful ledger, and I've learned to trust it. Danny's trust is safe, exactly as our father built it. He has a place of his own now close by with the support around him my father spent a lifetime making sure would be there. The system that held in the end because a frightened man built it in secret and an overlooked boy protected the key. Danny is learning the piano. Did I tell you that? He sits at our father's upright in the evenings and picks out the lullaby, one careful note at a time, and I set the brass metronome going beside him. Talk, talk, talk. And I tell him what our father told me. You don't chase it. You keep your own time and you let the music come to you. He's getting good. He doesn't chase it at all. He never did. He told me not long ago what he wants. We were at the piano, the metronome ticking, the window open to the first warm evening of the year, and out of nowhere, Danny gives you the important things sideways when you've stopped waiting for them. He said, I'm going to play Dad's song for people in a room with chairs. It took me a moment to understand he was describing a recital, his own. On a stage in front of an audience, the boy the evaluator called unresponsive, the boy his own brother-in-law had tried to have declared unable to hold the reins of his own life. I never forget the notes, he said, so I should be the one who plays them. I had to turn toward the window for a second so he wouldn't see my face. Outside, my father's yard was greening up again, the maple he'd planted the year Danny was born throwing its first real shade, and somewhere a neighbor's kid was learning to ride a bike. All that ordinary spring going on as if the world had not, in this house, been quietly set right. Yes, I said when I could. You should. You're the one who never forgets. So that's the plan. In the fall, in a small room with chairs, my brother is going to sit down at our father's restored piano and play the song A Dying Man Hid in the Wood, and I'm going to sit in the front row and keep my own time. And I think, I have to believe, that somewhere our Father will be keeping it with us. Talk, talk, talk. The steadiest sound in the dark. I want to leave you with the thing I understand now that I didn't a year ago, standing in a doorway with cold keys in my fist, looking at a gap in the wall. They told me I was a burden being carried. They told me my father left me nothing, that I owed them my gratitude, that the quiet man who raised us had died careless and broke. And the truth was the exact opposite of every word. He had left me everything, hidden in the one place he knew I'd look, guarded by the one person he knew would keep it. The people who tell you you have nothing are very often the people trying to take something from you. And the person the whole world overlooks is very often the one holding the thing that matters most. If you've made it all the way here with me, thank you. Truly. I don't know what's sitting in your family's quiet corners, what stories you've been handed and believed because you were tired and grieving, and it was easier than fighting. But I'll ask you the way my father would have asked me. Whose time are you keeping? Yours or theirs? If any part of this reached something in you, tell me about it below. I read them, all of them. And then go home and look at whatever's standing in the corner of your own life that everyone told you was worthless. Sound the cabinet. You might be surprised what your people left inside.